The first thing you're going to do when you approach a passage is to actually read the prompt, and you want to identify the rhetorical situation. So the College Board is going to give you some context for the passage, and you want to actually not only understand this, but include this in your essay as well. Typically in your introduction, however, you can also examine parts of this throughout your essay. So depending on the prompt you have, you're going to get some information like this. You're going to be told who the writer or speaker is. And so for the particular passage that we're looking at, it's going to be Florence Kelley, and she is an activist. So you could use that information in your intro. You could say activist Florence Kelley, or you might say Florence Kelley, comma, a women's rights and child labor advocate, comma, and finish your sentence. So you can include these necessary details. Now, you don't necessarily need to specify that someone is an author if your passage is a memoir or something like that, but they will give you some details that might help you out. So they give you what you need to know. And the audience, we know that the occasion is this particular conference here. So this is the group that she's speaking to. She's speaking in Philadelphia in 1905. So because of that, I inferred that she's speaking to a group of suffragists. So sometimes you can infer the audience, sometimes it is directly given to you. If you are given a passage that is an article or a memoir, that might not be very clear from the onset. You might have to interpret as you read the passage who the target audience is. But usually for a speech or a letter, they're going to tell you the context and exigence and audience in the prompt. So that information is provided. So I grouped it as occasion, but you might be familiar with the terms context and exigence. And then your prompt is going to say one of three things. It's going to ask about how the writer uses rhetorical choices to convey his or her message, achieve his or her purpose, or develop his or her argument. So you want to make sure that you are actually addressing the prompt given, but that being said, it doesn't mean that if your prompt is about an argument that you can't also examine purpose. So I want to be clear that you want to actually focus on the prompt given, but it doesn't mean that you can't actually talk about the message if your prompt is about purpose, because they all are part of the rhetorical situation. So make sure that you're sticking to your prompt, but also don't ignore other elements of the rhetorical situation. So the College Board has started providing a little bit more insight into what the message, argument, or purpose is. They used to just kind of stop after the phrase convey her message, but now they're actually giving you a bit more info. So you can use that info, but you also want to dig deeper. They're going to give you sort of a superficial purpose or message. They're not wrong. It's just that you need to take that knowledge and actually dig deeper as you read the passage. So for instance, right now, we know that she's against child labor, but we don't really know why, and we don't know any of her rhetorical choices yet because we haven't read the passage. So if she is developing an argument, I'm going to assume that there's sort of going to be three major parts. Usually when someone develops an argument, they have to introduce the problem, and they have a major claim, and then they develop that claim, and then they conclude, a beginning, middle, and end. So that might be a tip to help some of you guys, is think about the three major parts. And sometimes you have to read the passage before you can actually divide it up, but think about what are they doing in the beginning, what are they doing in the middle, and what are they doing at the end. So a choice is just something that the writer does. And you might have some outside knowledge, you might not, it depends on the prompt. So for this one, we know that women's suffrage, so basically the right to vote, happened in 1920. This particular speech was from 1905. Therefore, women did not have the right to vote at the time of this speech, and they could not then change laws because they didn't have the right to vote. So that could potentially be important. So I would say that students have to decide how they're going to tackle this on the exam. I wrote you guys a note here, and honestly, it really depends on which option is best for you. So some of my students are able to do this in their own head. In class, I have them either write it down on their prompts, or I have them do a graphic organizer, or we talk about it. It depends on what we're doing that day. But that is not exam day. So on exam day, if you just need to read it and you have it in your head and that's all you need, then that's fine. If you want to take that second to put it into a graphic organizer or to do notes like I've done here. If you think that would help you, then by all means do so. My caution is that for the exam, your job is to make sure you use your time efficiently, and that's going to vary from person to person. So how you do something in class might be appropriate for a class setting, but this is exam day, so you have to make certain choices for yourself. And I know that my students are going to be approaching that step differently. Some are going to do it in their heads, others are going to write it out. It just really depends. And so hopefully you can decide which option is best for you. And as far as where that rhetorical situation goes, I would include that in your intro so that your essay makes more sense. Your reader is going to be very familiar with your passage, but you still want to ease into it a little bit. You don't need a lengthy intro or a fancy intro, but you should include the historical context or the relevant rhetorical situation information. Not every passage is necessarily going to have historical context. And obviously you need a thesis, so that would be when you clearly identify the choices and either the purpose or message, whichever is what's asked of you. You can combine them in theory if you're able to. So now you need to actually start reading the passage. And so for this, there are different ways that students can do this. And so I'm going to show you guys how I would do it. But to be very honest, as I tell my own students in class, I just model it for you. And you need to decide what would work for you. So it's very important that you do what is going to work best on exam day. So I have some students who like to read the passage and annotate as they go. I sometimes do this. Other times I like to actually read the passage once very quickly and kind of get my bearings, and then I go back and read and annotate. And I have other students who do this method. And quite frankly, it takes them both roughly the same amount of time because they have a system in place. So if you have a system that works for you, you need to do that. Now, obviously, because this exam is not going to be taken in school in a lot of cases, most of you are going to be taking it at home, you have the option to print the passage. You could also annotate on your doc, which is what I'm going to be doing for this video, or you could use a separate piece of paper or graphic organizer. So please do what works best for you. So for my notes, I've got a couple started just to kind of speed this video up a little bit, but basically what I like to do is use active verbs in some of my bullet points, and I try to do a little bit of shorthand, that kind of thing. So some of these sentences that I've created here, they're not really full sentences, but some of these notes I could, in theory, use very quickly in an essay. And the other thing is that you sort of have to decide what is important and what isn't. And that might be one reason why some students like to read the passage first and then go back and annotate. If you read it quickly first, then you at least sort of know what is and is not important. Okay, so I've got a couple annotations here. Let me show you guys why I did these annotations. So these are from the first couple paragraphs of the speech. So I've got her speech here. This is not in 2 columns like the College Board normally does it because I thought it would be easier to see if it was like this. But you guys know that the College Board puts things in 2 columns. And so in this paragraph, she talks about how there are 2 million children under the age of 16 who are earning their bread. And so that means that they're working. So in this case, she's talking about children who are working as child laborers. And you can see the age range here. So they are as young as 6 years old and as old as 16. And she does reference a couple states, but we'll see that she does that later on as well. So then in this paragraph, she talks about how there is a steady increase from decade to decade, and the fastest growing group seems to be girls between the age of 14 and 20. So think about who she is and who the audience is. So let's go back to our rhetorical situation. She is female, Florence Kelley is female, and she's speaking to a group of women suffragists. So we're going to see that girls play a large role in what she's talking about. It's not that she totally ignores boys or anything like that, but you can see that she's going to be talking about girls quite a lot. So we know that this is a growing problem. If it's rapidly increasing, we know that it's urgent. So let's go ahead and look at these notes really quickly. So I wrote that basically you would say she. She notes that there are 2 million child laborers ages 6 to 16 in the US. So I just kind of paraphrased that. And then I put these dashes here just to kind of indicate that I consider that a startling fact. And this demonstrates the breadth and urgency of the issue. So the scope of it and the urgency of it. It also suggests that child labor laws are an issue that requires immediate attention because it's an issue that is growing. And then I put girls between 14 and 20 are the fastest growing group. Now, I might not need that note, but it seemed like a good fact, so I wanted to include that there. So now let's do the next paragraph, or maybe paragraphs together. So here it says, tonight while we sleep, several thousand little girls will be working in textile mills all the night through in the deafening noise of the spindles and the loom spinning and weaving cotton and wool, silks and ribbons for us to buy. So in this paragraph, I noticed that she's talking about how we, the audience, herself included, while they sleep, the girls are going to be working and there's deafening noise that does not sound very appealing. And they're creating these products for us to buy. So that is a contrast. And that is a choice. Now, you could call it maybe juxtaposition or something, but you don't really need to get that fancy. So we're going to say contrast us and the little girls. And then we've got sleeping and working. So just a quick note there to remind myself about the contrast. Now let's see if she continues that contrast or if she contrasts something else, because if she does, that would be a major choice that I want to analyze. So here she says, in Alabama, the law provides that a child under the age of 16 years shall not work in a cotton mill longer than 8 hours. And then it says that Alabama does better in this respect than any other southern state. And then she goes on to talk about others. So you can see here she talks about while we sleep, little white girls will be working through the night in mills in those states, working 11 hours a night. So I'm just going to take a quick note that Alabama has, and I'm going to put good laws here, not because that's a direct quote, but because it's still not great, but it's better than some of the other states. Okay, so now I see that she gives a different example. So this time she's talking about Georgia. So we've got at least 2 examples so far. So that is a choice that she's making. She's giving examples. So let's see what she says in Georgia. There's no restriction whatsoever. So we're going to just add Georgia, no restrictions. Okay, and so I might decide to do it this way. So we've got examples, and then I can maybe tab over so I can keep track of the different examples. So that seems to be a major choice to prove that child labor laws are an issue. So first she introduces this claim that there are 2 million children working in this nation, and then now she's giving us a sort of like breakdown of different states. So she makes a claim and then she proves it using these examples. And then it says, nor is it only in the South that these things occur. So she might be saying this because maybe the audience assumes, well, it's a Southern problem. This isn't really a Northern problem. It's pretty easy for us as humans to say, oh, well, that doesn't happen here. So now she talks about how Alabama does better than New Jersey. Well, New Jersey is a northern state. And so she's basically contrasting the laws in Alabama with the laws in New Jersey. So we already talked about contrast. So we're going to contrast New Jersey and Alabama. And Alabama did it better. Okay, and then I'm going to note not just a Southern, oops, spelled that wrong, Southern problem. On the exam, don't worry about your spelling. I have Grammarly installed. You need to uninstall that if you are taking the exam because it's not going to work with the exam software. But a lot of students sometimes get worried about spelling. And to be honest, guys, it's not something that can truly impact your score unless it is so bad that we can't read it. And I feel like if that was the case, your teacher would have already said something to you. I've mentioned this in a couple of videos, but I've had students who have spelled things phonetically and they still scored well. Now, granted, that's anecdotal evidence and it was on the old exam, but I would not worry about spelling during the time constraints. So now let's see what else she does here. So she's talking about New Jersey and how they took a step backward. So that step backward was that this law was repealed. And so now basically there are sort of like different parameters. She says that after their 14th birthday, they have the pitiful privilege of working all night long. So I might say New Jersey, good law repealed. I like that phrase because it's a bit interesting. Pitiful, privilege, working, and then let me see what she said. Working, all night long. You know what? Because she put it as one quote, we'll do that too. And basically, if I know that this is a direct quote because I've put these quotation marks here, if I'm typing my essay, I could just, in theory, copy and paste this and embed it into a sentence, or I could at least have it to where I don't have to go back and forth between my notes and the passage. So that's going to be up to you in your judgment, how you want to deal with your notes. Okay, so then we have one more paragraph that seems to have an example. So it says, in Pennsylvania. And now she's talking about, like, you know, on your 13th birthday, a girl could work. We've got this midnight luncheon. So normally lunch is at noon, but she's really emphasizing the difference between like normal circumstances and what these girls are going through. And all of this can happen without violating any law of the Commonwealth. So like the state of Pennsylvania. So one thing to consider when you have examples like this is the order. So the reason why I think she ends with Pennsylvania is that's the state where she's speaking. So it's kind of like close to home. Now, this might not be the only reason. Like sometimes in other speeches, maybe they do things in chronological order. So if you have a series of examples, ask yourself why they put it in the order that they did, because that is a choice. So not only would I be examining the examples, but I would be looking at the order. Now, she looked at 4 different states, essentially, so that could be a lot to tackle in one paragraph, but you want to kind of mention these examples, and how you phrase it could really compress this a little bit. And what I mean by that is you don't necessarily have to say, and then she talks about Alabama, and then she talks about Georgia, and then she talks about New Jersey. You could say that she contrasts Alabama, which has better laws, with Georgia, which has no restrictions whatsoever. Similarly, Alabama's laws are better than that of New Jersey, indicating that it's not just a Southern problem. And so that way I've gone through 3 of those examples without having to say, okay, and then she does this, and then she does this. Okay, so I'm going to highlight this because that is a major choice that I want to talk about. So this is actually probably going to be my first body paragraph. So the major choice I want to talk about is the fact that she's using these examples, and then within the examples, we see some contrast. And so I would want to talk about that as well. So you want to have like a major strategy, a major choice, the primary focus of your paragraph. But then there are other choices that could be complementing it. So even though I'm talking about examples, there's also some contrast within these examples. And I could also talk about the tone. I could talk about how this is a logical appeal. So that would be something that I would note later. So I'm going to continue working through the passage, and talking to you guys about what I noticed and what I would emphasize in an essay. But at the end, I'm going to actually kind of do a quick outline to show you what I would include in each of the body paragraphs. And that is going to be an optional step that you might consider. I'm going to try to do it in a bit more detail than what I would expect you guys to do on the day of the exam. And let me show you guys what I read first. So I was focusing on essentially this portion right here where she is posing questions. Now, just as a word of caution, you want to make sure that you're not necessarily calling it a rhetorical question if it's not actually rhetorical. So it's totally okay to just say that the writer or speaker poses questions, because you don't want to sort of misidentify something as a rhetorical question if it's not. And so what I did here is I took a little bit more detailed notes. I would say I wrote that she poses questions to contest that if women could vote, these laws would not be in place. And then I took a second to try to think of some commentary. So why is she actually asking these questions? I think the obvious answer might be to get her audience to think about something. Well, what does she actually want them to think about? It's almost like she's reminding them that they can't vote. But she's saying, well, if you could vote, then you would change this, but you can't. So she's not really blaming them. But keep in mind who they are. They're suffragists, are women who want to have the right to vote. And so given that she's speaking to suffragists, they will likely agree with her that if women could vote, these harsh laws would not be in place. So she's tailoring her message to their shared desire to vote, to their values, because they want change. So when you guys are looking at a choice, I want you to ask yourself, why is the writer using this choice given who the audience is? This is particularly helpful for speeches and letters. It does apply to other things like articles and memoirs, but sometimes the audience might be a bit less obvious in those cases. That being said, writers and speakers make choices for a reason, and it's tailored to their audience. So because this particular audience is very keen on activism, particularly trying to get women to vote, she seems to be wanting to kind of capitalize on that. And she wants to kind of tie these two causes together. So child labor and women's rights are not two totally separate entities, but rather they are related. And we're going to see this as she continues. So I took more detailed notes here, but the major choice that I was talking about was just the fact that she's posing questions. And then these notes right here are just reminders of what I might want to say as far as commentary. And the reason why I personally tend to write notes like this sometimes is because sometimes when I think of something, if I'm taking an exam and I'm under pressure, if I tell myself, oh, I need to remember that, and I don't actually write it down, then I forget. Whereas if I write it down, I'm more likely to remember it. But if I don't, then I know where to look in my notes, and then I don't have to stress about it. So it's kind of a personal choice there, but I was trying to actually give a little bit of commentary there that I could potentially work into an essay. So now we're going to return to the passage itself, and I noticed that she's using some interesting word choice throughout this section, so I wanted to call your attention to that. So we still see the use of particular pronouns, like she's saying our shoes. And so remember, she's speaking about the people present, and she is uniting herself with them. So that could be important because she's not necessarily blaming them. It's not like she's saying your shoes or your stockings. She is including herself in that. But you don't want to write your essay as if you were somehow part of that audience, because none of you were around in 1905. So that could be something you could examine, is that she is including herself with the audience rather than blaming them, because she could have said your shoes and your stockings, but she didn't. And if she were to blame them, they would be less receptive to her message. If that's the case, then they're not going to want to help her when she gets to her call to action. So she needs to call their attention to this issue in a way that's going to make them care, but not in a way that will alienate them. So a lot of what I just said could potentially be commentary in an essay as well. So you'll notice that she talks about all the things that they do here, like they spin and they weave, they braid. So she's giving details about what these children do, and all of this is to produce like basically luxuries. So we've got buckles, we've got ornaments. I don't think she's talking about like Christmas tree ornaments here. I think she's talking about just like, you know, decorations, maybe like jewelry or something. But she's talking about like pins and hat pins. We don't really use hat pins anymore. But notice the description here, the sweating system. So she's throwing in these words to emphasize the amount of work that the children are doing, and also the different types of products that they're creating that the audience enjoys. So the audience has luxuries while these children are sweating in the factories. So we see a contrast there between what the people in the audience, herself included, enjoy versus what the children have to do to make these things. And so you can see that she, again, talks about like artificial flowers and things like that. So you wouldn't necessarily have to list every single thing that she talks about, but rather just kind of group it that she's speaking about these luxuries. You can kind of group all that together. Now, if you wanted to pull specific evidence from this, you could, but the idea here, I think, that I'm going to add to my notes would just be this potential contrast. So we saw a contrast earlier between the different states. Now we have a contrast between the audience and the child workers. So we've got this idea of like luxury versus work. And I would say that this is an emotional appeal. So when you have an emotional appeal, you need to actually specify which emotion. You don't want to just leave it at emotional appeal. So she's trying to evoke a sense of sympathy for these children because of her description. So for instance, as my evidence, I might say the phrase sweating system, because that makes us feel pity for these children. And also, if we go back to the passage, she says the children. Okay, so I was looking to see if she called them children or girls, because I was looking to see if she was creating a sense of like female solidarity, and it doesn't appear so yet if it happens, because here it's just children. So she doesn't actually say girls in an overemphasized way in this particular paragraph. Okay, so I would kind of leave it at that for those notes. So I could expand that quite a bit, but now I at least know that that is a major choice that I found. And so I might add maybe like one more thing. I might just say that it's like got detail. That way I can remember to go back and maybe look at some of the specific details if I need to. Okay, so if we continue on in the passage, and we're almost done, it says that we do not wish this. We prefer to have our work done by men and women. So basically, like, kind of saying, like, this isn't what we want. So again, trying not to make them feel like guilty, or at least like too guilty. She doesn't want to blame them. So that's the second time that I've kind of mentioned that. So I might put that in my notes so that I don't forget it. Doesn't want to blame the audience. Apparently I can't spell when I try to talk and type. I might say something like unites herself with them, because that might be a choice that I could talk about as I'm talking about this contrast. Like, she's uniting herself with the audience, so she's on this side with the audience, and then there's the child workers as well. So that could be some of the motivation behind the choice, is that she wants them to be more receptive. So let me add that to wants them to be more receptive to her call to action. So I'm just going to write CTA for call to action. Now, we haven't actually gotten to her call to action yet, but generally speaking, call to actions come at the end of a passage. That's basically when the writer or speaker challenges the audience to go out and do something. So notice her word choice here. She says that we, meaning the women, are almost powerless, but not wholly powerless. However, are the citizens who enjoy the right of petition. So, you know, the men who can vote. So basically, another reminder of their current status, that they don't have the right to vote. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit so you guys can see. And I'm going to say reminds audience of current status, basically that they can't vote. So I might say, maybe just for some quotes here in case I want to work that in. Let's see how she phrased it. She said almost powerless. Kind of like telling them, hey, we are limited, but we're not entirely powerless. And then it sounds like, here's the solution. Like, here's what we need to do about it. But that particular thought is going to strike a nerve with her audience because they're suffragists, they want the right to vote. So when you remind people of something that they want but don't yet have, that's going to strike a nerve with that particular group. And in a positive way in this case, like it's probably going to strike some passion within them because it's going to appeal to their sense of justice, perhaps. Okay, so now let's look at the passage again. So we have 2 paragraphs left. And one of the things that I think we need to look at is this sentence right here. We can enlist the working men. All right, so the men who have the right to vote. And then here, this last part is also particularly important. This is her call to action. For the sake of the children, for the republic in which these children will vote after we are dead. So basically like thinking ahead to the future. And for the sake of our cause. Okay, so what is their cause? Their cause is women's rights and women's suffrage. We should enlist the working men voters with us in this task of freeing the children from toil. So that is her big call to action, which is basically join with the men to end child labor. And also she mentions a better future, and I liked the phrase our cause. So basically like these are not separate clauses here. They are intertwined in some way. Okay, so those would be the notes that I would take on the passage. And again, some of these might be a little bit more detailed than what a student might want to do on the exam. But the idea here would be to then break this up into the paragraphs. So I already highlighted that I wanted to talk about examples. And I think something else that I would want to talk about might be the fact that she is posing questions that probably couldn't be its own paragraph by itself, but I could do sort of like a section analysis. I would also want to talk about the contrast. So that would be something that I would want to include in one of my paragraphs. And then the call to action. So those are kind of my major things. So then I need to decide, okay, what is going in each of my paragraphs and how many paragraphs am I going to write? So one of the questions that students have been asking in preparation for the 2020 AP Lang exam is how many body paragraphs do I actually need? And what I tell my students is that I would rather see 2 well-developed body paragraphs instead of 3 mediocre ones. Because sometimes when students try to force a 3rd body paragraph, they might actually underdevelop all of their ideas and they might run out of steam. They might not pace correctly. It is possible to write 3 well-developed body paragraphs though. So I don't want to discourage you from doing that. It's just that you as a student writer need to make that decision. You need to figure out if you're going to have enough time and if you can pace yourself correctly. And sometimes I've had students intend to write 3, but then they only manage 2. And that's okay as well. You need to remember that this is a rough draft. So I would say that you should go for development regardless of the number of body paragraphs. And so here what I did, just to kind of illustrate this point, is I did 2 columns. So we have 2 body paragraphs over here and 3 body paragraphs over here. And I kept the information exactly the same. It's just that I broke it up differently. So in the 2 body paragraph side, I have just kind of some general notes here. So in my first body paragraph, I might talk very briefly about how she establishes her argument. So she has to clue everybody in on the fact that she is against child labor. She has to make this claim. So remember, she starts out by talking about the 2 million children who are earning wages. And so then from there, she actually uses examples to prove this claim. So we have to make a claim and then we have to prove it. And so the bulk of this paragraph really would be analyzing those examples because I would want to look at how she is contrasting the different laws in between the different states and how she's talking about different parts of the country. And so the reason would be that it's an issue, a national issue that requires urgent attention. So that would be what I would focus on in my first body paragraph if I were doing 2. And I think I could do a pretty well-developed paragraph based on that. And so that would sort of be like the beginning of the speech. And I want to try to work chronologically as well as I can. So in my second body paragraph, I would sort of be combining the middle and the end. So I noted that she contrasts her audience and the children, and I also gave a brief explanation as to why. So I'm not going to focus on the emotional appeal as my major choice. I'm going to focus on the contrast as the major choice. And then because of that contrast, she is essentially appealing to pathos. But I prefer that students not actually say uses pathos, or I really prefer that they don't even say pathos in general. I want you to identify the specific emotion. So in this case, it's a sense of pity or maybe sympathy. You could even say maybe frustration. So that would be the first part of the paragraph. And then I would also talk about how, since she does that, it creates a sense of unity. And then I would kind of go through the different things. So she reminds the audience that they can't vote. That's through posing those questions. And also that she does this to get to her call to action. So the verb implores means that she is like basically asking them to join with the men. She is urging them to do this. And why does she want them to do this? Well, it's going to create a better present and a better future. So that would be how I would break it down for a sort of chronological analysis of having two different paragraphs. Now, I'm still analyzing choices. It's just that I'm kind of dividing the passage essentially in half. And so there would be analysis of major choices, and I would be looking at the different progressions of the different movements in the piece. And so that would be the 2-paragraph way. For the 3-paragraph way, just for the purposes of demonstration to hopefully clarify this for some students, I kept the exact same words. I just broke it up. So if I wanted to do this in 3 paragraphs instead, I would keep body paragraph 1 the same because she's introducing her argument and she's supporting it with these examples. So to me, that's kind of like her step 1. Her step 2, in my opinion, would be the vivid details and the contrast between the audience and the children. And those, I think, are working together. So I would put those as the second body paragraph. And then if I were doing a third body paragraph and I had time to do so, instead of having the call to action be here, combined with this second body paragraph, I would have it be its own. And so that way I could dig a little bit deeper and explore a little bit more. So it really depends on what you're capable of in the time period that you have for the exam. I personally, if I had the choice, I would want to do this 3-paragraph essay for this prompt based on what I've broken it down into. That being said, if I ran out of time, I would have to combine these 2 paragraphs because I don't want to ignore this part about the better future. I don't want to ignore her call to action. If you guys want to see what this would look like in an actual essay, then I'm going to be demonstrating that in a separate video, so I hope you will check that out. If you found this video useful, or if you're just cramming for the exam in general, then go ahead and give this video a thumbs up. Best of luck on the exam, guys, and until next time, happy writing!